AMD's 9955HX3D is the best CPU you can currently get for a gaming laptop, period. But it costs more compared to the non-3D version. So is it worth spending more to get the 3D? I've compared both in 30 games at 3 resolutions, as well as thermals, power draw, battery life, and way more to find out. These two processors are almost exactly the same. They've both got 16 cores, 32 threads, a 5.4 GHz boost clock, and the same amount of L1 and L2 cache. But where the 3D version differs is in the L3 cache, where it has twice the amount, and 128 megs of L3 cache is way higher than most other laptop CPUs. But laptops with these specs are not cheap, so if we find a good deal on any gaming laptops with either of these processors, we'll add them to our gaminglaptop.deals website. You can save money with that link below. I'm using XMG's Neo 16 to do this testing as fairly as possible, because both of these laptops are exactly the same except for the processor, which means a perfectly fair apples-to-apples comparison. Both of these laptops allow us to adjust the power limit of the CPU through the control center software, and more power equals more performance, but also more heat. This graph shows the Cinebench multi-core score for both processors at different power levels. Cinebench doesn't really care about the extra cache, so there's almost no difference between them, and the small gap that we are seeing might just be silicon lottery luck, as the chips are the same otherwise. I've tested all apps at 80 watts to represent a low performance mode, and 150 watts to show max performance. But yeah, in this test the difference is negligible. Temperatures were about the same in this workload with the fan set to the same speed, and both were running at pretty much the same clock speeds over all 16 cores. The 3D chip was using a little more power with both limited to 150 watts, but less at 80 watts, though it was also scoring a little lower at 80 watts too. This puts the 3D chip slightly ahead from a performance per watt perspective, but ultimately there's no difference in this rendering workload, and it's a similar deal in other rendering workloads like Blender, V-Ray, or Corona Renderer, only minor differences, though the 3D version was slightly ahead in all cases at both power levels. The biggest difference I found was in LLVM compilation, where the 9955HX3D was completing the task more than 25% faster than the 9955HX at both power levels. The values are in seconds here, so lower is better now, and presumably something about this compilation workload loves the extra cache. But apart from that, pretty much every other non-gaming workload I tested was slightly better on the 3D, but the margins were quite small and aren't enough to justify picking the more expensive 3D version. No, that'll matter much more when it comes to gaming. On average, out of these specific tests, the 3D version was only about 3% faster compared to the non-3D version, so clearly most of the workloads I test for CPU comparisons don't care a whole lot about the cache difference. And it's pretty much the same deal with both running at 150 watts. LLVM compilation was the only major outlier in favor of the 9955HX3D. So AMD beats AMD, but does AMD beat AMD in gaming? I've tested both CPUs in 30 games at 1080p, 1440p, and even 4K to see if the 3D's extra cache actually makes a difference at higher resolutions. Spoiler, sometimes it does, and a difference at 4K isn't something we usually see in CPU comparisons. Baldur's Gate 3 had the biggest win on the 9955HX3D out of all 30 games tested at 1080p, reaching a 65% higher average frame rate, an insane difference considering how close performance was in those non-gaming workloads earlier. Even the dips in performance, showed by the 1% lows, were higher than the average FPS coming out of the 9955HX. The 3D still had a 42% lead at 1440p, but then at 4K, where we're more GPU bound, the average FPS difference is quite small, though the 3D chip still had a 25% higher 1% low, which in other words means the CPU selection is still affecting performance at 4K, something we don't normally see. Fortnite was tested at low settings and had some pretty big gains on the 3D too, reaching a 38% higher average frame rate at 1080p, 40% higher at 1440p, and 23% higher at 4K. This was the biggest gain for the 3D chip at 4K out of all 3 resolutions tested. So yeah, some games depending on the settings can still see big improvements with the right processor. PUBG also had above average gains with the 9955HX3D, reaching a 36% 32% higher average FPS at 1080p, a smaller but still substantial 15% lead at 1440p, and then only a 3% gain at 4K. Though, like Baldur's Gate, the difference in 1% lows is bigger than the difference in average FPS, which just means the 3D is more stable and consistent. Hogwarts Legacy, on the other hand, didn't really see any major differences when it came to the 1% lows, but the 3D chip still provided a 34% boost to average FPS at 1080p, a 14% improvement at 1440p, and then basically no real difference at 4K. Of course, not every game saw big gains with the 9955HX 3D. Performance was basically identical on both laptops in Dying Light 2. Granted, I tested at high settings, maybe it would be a different story with lower settings, but I don't think there's much point when 4K still sustained 60 FPS without even making use of upscaling. Microsoft Flight Simulator didn't see any differences in average FPS, though there was a nice 14% improvement to 1% lows on the 3D at 1080p, though it's questionable how much 1080p gaming you'd be doing with this hardware. Spiderman 2 had above average gains with the 9955HX 3D, reaching a 32% higher average frame rate at 1080p, though the gap between them was much smaller at 1440p, and then basically non-existent at 4K. Counter-Strike 2 was another big win for our 3-dimensional processor, reaching a 21% higher average FPS at 1080p and 22% better at 1440p, the third largest difference at this resolution out of all 30 games tested. Even 4K gets some benefit from the extra cache. Civ 6 turn time was tested with the game's AI benchmark, so we're looking at how long it takes a turn to complete here rather than FPS, which means lower numbers are better. The resolution also doesn't matter for this test, and the extra cache doesn't seem to help, with all results within margin of error range. Instead of individually talking through the rest of the 21 games tested, I'll just quickly skip through the results on screen now. Some of them still see big differences, but I already focused on the games with the bigger differences, so feel free to pause the video if you want a closer look at any of the other games tested. I think it's important to test a wide selection of games so that we can get an accurate picture of the average performance differences to make the fairest possible conclusion. In other words, more data equals more better. Let's take a look at those average differences next. On average, over all 30 games tested, at 1080p, AMD's Ryzen 9 9955HX 3D was almost 15% faster compared to their 9955HX, which has half the level 3 cache. Baldur's Gate 3 was a massive win on the 3D, but half of the games tested still had double-digit percentage improvements with that third dimension. The gains are even bigger if we compare the 1% lows, with the 3D 18% ahead of the non-3D. We've only got 27 of the 30 games featured here, as some of the tests don't record 1% lows. Honestly, I think this makes more of a difference than the boost to average FPS, as the 9955HX 3D ensures a smoother, consistent frame rate while playing. It's cool that 1080p sees such awesome gains, but consider that gaming laptops paired with either of these processors will generally have GPUs that are capable of 1440p gaming with 1440p screens. At 1440p, the 9955HX 3D now only had a 6% lead when compared to the 9955HX in average FPS, with just 5 of the 30 games now experiencing a double-digit improvement. Higher resolutions are just more GPU bound, so the differences between CPUs matters less. That said, some games still had some pretty massive improvements on the 3D, and there's still a larger 10% improvement to 1% lows at 1440p with the power of the third dimension. Depending on the games you're playing, the 9955HX 3D will definitely help improve the gaming experience at QHD or QHD+. At 4K, the 9955HX 3D was only 2% faster than the 9955HX in terms of average FPS. Fortnite and Counter-Strike were the biggest outliers. Otherwise, the CPU just doesn't matter much at this higher resolution. The 3D gets us a 5% boost to 1% lows across all games tested at 4K, and the boost could definitely be useful in competitive games like Fortnite or PUBG. Here's how frame rates look if we instead take the average of all games at all resolutions. I think this better allows us to visually see the overall difference in a quick and easy summary. Honestly, both laptops perform great. I mean, they've got RTX 5090 laptop GPUs, so you'd expect that. But we don't normally see this much of a difference from a CPU change. The difference at 1440p is almost the equivalent of going up to the next tier of GPU, and the 5090 Ti doesn't exist yet. so this is as good as we can get. The integrated graphics are the same on both, but they're too weak to bother with for gaming. The 3D V-cache didn't help its 720p medium settings in Cyberpunk, presumably because the GPUs are just too much of a limit. Just for reference, this game running on the 5090 discrete graphics at 1080p ultra settings still saw a 10% higher average FPS with the 3D chip, and a 22% higher 1% low, so the game is affected. It just doesn't matter for the iGPUs. Battery life wasn't great on either laptop, but it lasted 15% longer on the non-3D laptop. However, this unfortunately is not a perfectly fair test. My 3D laptop actually has a mini LED panel, while the non-3D is IPS. So although I ran them both at the same brightness, power requirements would be different. I wanted to try connecting a monitor to the integrated graphics, but I had other problems that prevented that. So this is what we've got. So what sort of a price difference are we looking at between 3D and non-3D versions? Prices will of course change over time, so check the links below the videos for updates and to see if there are any current sales. Because if gaming laptops with either of these CPUs do have a good sale, we'll add them to the gaminglaptop.deals website. We update that every day to include all of the best sales. So make sure you check it out regularly to save money on your next gaming laptop with that link below. At the time of recording in late July, the Asus Strix G16 was the only laptop I could find in the US that's available with both processors in the exact same chassis. In this case, it's only $100 more expensive to get the 3D, or about 4% more money. Over in Germany, where my XMG laptops came from, for the exact configuration I've tested, we're looking at €4,089 for AMD's 9955HX with 5090, or an extra €215 to get the 3D, which translates to 5% more money for the 9955HX 3D. But despite costing more, the 9955HX 3D offers better value from a cost per frame perspective at 1080p and 1440p resolutions. The 3D offers slightly worse value if you're gaming at 4K, as the frame rates were much closer together at this resolution. But that said, if you're spending this much money, you probably just want the best performance and don't care as much about the value. Based on those price differences, honestly, I think you'd be kinda crazy to buy the 9955HX instead of spending a little extra to get the 9955HX 3D, at least if you plan on gaming. Of course, not every single laptop that is available with a 9955HX also has a 9955HX 3D version, so the 3D might not always be an option. But if it is, I strongly suggest going for the 3D, even if it's $100, $200, maybe even $300 more. As we saw in most other non-gaming workloads, the extra cache from the third dimension doesn't really help, unless you're doing specific tasks that do benefit from level 3 cache like code compilation. But even then, I doubt the gains we saw in my test will apply to all code compilation scenarios. But what about Intel? I'll compare the 3D against Intel soon. Get subscribed. But until then, you can see how the Intel Core Ultra 9 275HX compares against AMD's 9955HX in that one next. The differences weren't quite what I was expecting.